So the story is of Leroy Henry. As you say, he was an African-American GI who was sent over here to train and get ready for D-Day. And he was based in a village outside Bath, Southstoke, and just at the beginning of May, on the 5th of May, nearly 80 years ago, he was picked up for raping a English girl, and there was a court-martial that followed, and he was sentenced to death. And the thing that fascinated me was that this story became a cause célèbre in Bath. There was a huge groundswell of support for Leroy Henry. There was a huge reaction against the death sentence that he'd been handed, and a petition started. Now, to give it a bit of context, this happened just before D-Day, and news of the court-martial and the death sentence came out very imminently, just as D-Day was days away. And in the week around this sort of momentous event, a petition started that gave 33,000 signatures in a very short space of time. It garnered the interest of the Daily Mirror, which was the leading tabloid paper of the time. It was the paper of the forces, the working man's paper. They put an editorial in its paper pleading for clemency, saying this is a terrible injustice and the British people feel that Anglo-American relations are being damaged. Parliament raised it. It became such a huge campaign that Eisenhower himself became directly involved in this. He ordered a second review of the case. He appointed a brilliant Harvard lawyer who was part of the US Army to look at the case, and he decided that charges, having gone through all the evidence, really shouldn't have even been brought. And the momentous effect was that Eisenhower got involved. He disapproved the sentence. He restored the soldier to duty, and he went off to France, continued his career, and life carried on in Bath as if nothing had happened.
Was the woman telling the truth? Do we know that?
We have to look at the evidence here, and the evidence shows that there was physical evidence that she had been raped. The evidence pointed to the fact they had a consensual sexual relationship. The exchange of money was involved, and this was in fact their third encounter. And going through the court-martial transcript is thrilling. It's like reading a drama script. Go through the evidence, nothing added up. He knocked on a window in the dead of night. This was meant to be a stranger's house. It obviously wasn't. She opened the window, she came down, she willingly went with him. He heard noises inside the house. I don't think he was expecting that. He heard voices. It was actually her husband's voice. And he said, "Oh, can you show me the directions to the station? I'm lost. I need to go back to Bristol." And she lived very close to the road, and she pointed it from the doorstep, but she was saying, oh, he didn't understand the way, so she had to literally go down on this bright moonlit night where the direction could clearly be seen to accompany him. None of the neighbours around heard any screaming, any noise, and in fact many people know and testified not to the court-martial. They weren't asked to testify, but they wrote into Eisenhower saying that we knew they were going out together. So it was a case full of holes. The feeling was very much, certainly at the Daily Mirror, at the Foreign Office, people who knew about the case felt that they would never have got a guilty verdict in a British court of law. But obviously this was the Second World War, this was an American soldier, so he was subject to American law. And the biggest hoo-ha of all was that rape did not carry the death penalty in Britain at the time. It was an American penalty. So this kind of exacerbated the differences between British and American law, and there was very much a feeling that he was punished like this specifically because he was black.
Have you uncovered how the people of Bath were reacting then to the way black Americans were almost treated, well, they were treated as second-class citizens within the military?
I think the reaction to Leroy Henry is a reaction to how black Americans were seen to be treated by the US Army. I think it embodied a whole range of feelings. Basically, Anglo-American relationship was key to the Second World War. We all know that. What's lesser known is there were huge tensions between the occupying army that was called by George Orwell, that's how he described Britain, an occupied nation. Suddenly, just because people spoke the same language, they were, largely Protestant, they were thought to have been the same, but there were huge cultural divides. And one of the biggest divides was the way that segregation affected America. The army was segregated. I didn't know that when I started researching, but you had black soldiers and white soldiers doing very different jobs. Right up until pretty much the last bit of the war, black soldiers weren't even allowed to fight. They were the services of supply. They did the dirty, hard, dangerous work of engineering, quartermastering. So all of these emotions and all of this feeling that this wasn't quite cricket summed up the reaction in Bath to Leroy Henry. It wasn't just the fact that it wasn't a case that should have even gone to court. It was the fact that he was black, and I think part of it also was a reaction to the American occupation of Britain. I think all of these feelings, it was specific to this case, to Leroy Henry, and then it was a wider general discontent. Generally the relationship worked, obviously we know that, but there was a lot of hostility and tension that was sort of covered up.
The book is written, but how can the people of Bath help you now?
What I'm really after is some help illustrating the heroes of our tale. So this was a petition, 33,000, that started in Jack Allen's cafe. Jack Allen ran a cafe in Holloway. It was what we'd call a trucker's cafe in the old days, a transport cafe, where you'd have eggs and bacon and coffee and people would get together, and it was a working man's place. And what this story for me also uncovers is the fact that Bath was very much a working city then. We think of it all of the Georgian finery and as a film set now for so many dramas, but actually it was better known for its industrial heritage and its industrial work at the time. And this was a working man's petition that uncovered the whole sort of spectrum of American tensions, but it crossed social divides. So it started as a working man's petition, and the heroes of this were Sam Day, who was an alderman, and he went on to be the first Labour mayor of Bath, and I've been lucky enough to contact his grandson, so I've got pictures and I can talk about him and I've got knowledge of him. I've got no knowledge really of Jack Allen beyond what I can find in the archives, and so what I'm after is anyone who remembers Jack Allen, his daughter Pat, who became Pat Spavin. I've kind of come against a brick wall, and he did such a heroic job in saving this man's life, because that's what these two guys did between them. They started something that was very powerful, and I'd like to pay tribute to them. So any help with Jack Allen is what I'm after.
Kate, it's not the first book you've written about American GIs in Britain. An American Uprising was the first. Very briefly, that was also in the West Country, wasn't it? An event in the Southwest.
It was a mutiny of African American soldiers in Launceston, Cornwall, and I found out about this through my dad, who was raised there, and it was all people were talking about, this dramatic shootout. I basically did a Freedom of Information request many years ago, and I was able to tell the story, and basically this was the third time that these black soldiers had been restricted to camp. They worked very hard, but they weren't allowed to go into town, and something gave and they mutinied in a very dramatic way, prompting a court-martial that really was headline news in Britain and America for 3 years. In the course of my wider research, I heard about a man called Leroy Henry that happened a bit further down the line, closer to D-Day, and it just so happened that we'd moved very close to Bath at the time, and I felt I had to do justice to this story too.
Why, of all the things you could have researched and written about, because I know you like history, did you choose the Second World War and the tensions between white and black Americans?
Just because it was there. I didn't know it was a segregated army when I started this. I had no idea that there were tensions. I actually think the Second World War will be seen in time as an important stepping stone in the civil rights journey. The racial tension that was exploding over in America. The war is a great social reformer on so many levels. It got women working on unprecedented scales here. In America, Roosevelt had to open up the factories to everyone. So this throwing people together in a country that was segregated, where in the majority of states mixed marriages were illegal, this sort of brought everything to bear. And I find it fascinating. The story is there in the archive, but people have chosen to ignore it. It has been it's been written out of history. We like to sugarcoat history, don't we? And I think the real story there is the people of colour who were fighting in the war, who were affected by the war. It's there, and it's time for us to start researching about it. It's there, and it's such an interesting story.